You've all been waiting for it. Part 4 of my favorite opening, the Black Lion / Philidor Defense, and talking about what I consider the scariest variation one can play against you, but probably one of the most uncommon. All of that coming straight up. What do I consider the scariest variation in the Philidor Defense? The scariest variation that I think is pawn e4, pawn d6, pawn d4, knight f6, knight c3, knight bd7, and in this position, instead of playing pawn f4, which I call the scary variation, but it's actually not so scary if you know what to do against it, or the knight f3 variation, which basically just plays into the main line, but this very inconspicuous, not very very suspicious looking move, pawn to h3. Now, when I say pawn h3 is one of the scariest variation, I don't mean, for example, if you play pawn e5 and he transposes directly back to a main line. This isn't scary at all. In fact, h3 is probably just wasting a move, and we're not really scared about that because we know what the basic plan is. In this position, pawn c6, pawn b5, pawn b4, using all our pieces to attack that e4 square is basically all we need to do for the rest of the game. Instead, what I'm scared against is somebody who knows how to play against this defense over here, and by playing h3, they're basically saying they want to play what I call the actual scary variation here. And so after pawn to h3, we just play normally. We play pawn e5, and in this position, you know your opponent's going into this variation if he plays one of two moves. If he plays knight e2, or he plays pawn to g4. And so this is the point of this pawn h3 move. The point is that they're going to put the bishop on g2, and they're going to unleash their pawn to g4. And that's why I consider this variation a little bit scary, because if you don't know what to do, it can be quite menacing. And even if you do know what to do, well, it's pretty difficult to play as well. Well, more difficult than most of the normal variations. And so in this position, after your opponent plays g4, a good rule of thumb is to, well, never take on g4, but to play this very simple h6 move, with the very simple idea of stopping g5. You're never scared of pawn g5 because they just created a weakness on h3 for you to attack. You're not going to castle anytime soon. Don't castle here because there might be some problems. But the idea is you're just going to play bishop e7. You have a much more solid pawn structure than your opponent. Your opponent's not very happy here. So you're not scared of that. So let's say your opponent plays bishop g2, and we're just going to play bishop c7, and they play knight e2. Now, there are a lot of variations you can play here. You could just castle, you could play knight h7, you can play pawn c6, but one variation that I really recommend and I found a lot of success with in these positions is just this knight f8 variation. And this knight f8 variation is a little bit different. You might find it a little bit peculiar, but the idea is quite simple. By playing knight f8, we're going to have our bishop out over here, attacking this g4 pawn and putting a lot of pressure that we normally wouldn't have in any normal given Philidor position. And in this position here, our opponent can never play this h4 move because then the g4 pawn hangs. And I want you to think about where we're going to move this knight. Do you think we're going to move it back here, 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 here? And if your answer is g6, you're absolutely correct. So let's say our opponent plays bishop e3, we just play knight g6 here, with the idea of maybe we can hop into h4 in some given position and try to take advantage of our opponent's weak dark squares that they created on the king side. And already in this position, white's doing pretty well. And so, black's doing pretty well. He's almost equalized at this point, even though it looks very scary that our opponent has all these pawns right in front of our face. So let's say our opponent plays queen d2. And you can kind of see what our opponent's trying to do here. He's trying to castle on the queen side. And so I've only had one of these games happen in my own life, and it happens against a very highly rated titled player. I might show you guys that game one day. However, the idea here is that you can plop your knight to h4, attack the bishop, be a little annoying. If they castle kingside, all of a sudden you're just completely fine. There's nothing to be worried about, life is good. But if they played rook g1, obviously you can see that they're castling queenside. You can take on g2 if you really want to. There's really no need. I recommend just playing pawn c6 because it's what we know. After they castle queenside, just go for moves like pawn b5, pawn h5, pawn h4, pawn b4, and basically go for your queenside attack, while your opponent's kingside attack is kind of stuck. He can't really go anywhere, and it's a little bit bad for our opponent. And if he ever decides to do this, as you guys know, these positions are mostly great for black. So, let's go back now. So why do I consider this scary a variation when it seems to me that through the main lines of this sideline over here, Black often does quite fine. Well, what I consider pretty scary is if our opponent decides to play the f4 move in this position over here. And this f4 move looks quite scary, and it actually is very scary because it's very difficult to know what to do in these type of positions. Do you castle here? Do you just take on f4? Do you take on d4? There's a lot of pressure on e5. And so my recommendation for you guys to help you guys remember is basically don't do anything. Don't capture on f4. Don't capture on d4 until the time is right. When is the time is right? You're just gonna have to calculate some variation to determine when to know when the time is right. And so the reason why this f4 variation it's super scary and looks very strong is because he can also push at any given point. But from my experiences analyzing this position, whenever our opponent plays pawn f4, let's say we just castle here and he plays pawn f4, these variations aren't that good for them because we get this knight h4 move. And now we have what we call a dark square blockade in this position. Let's say they decide to castle over here. We have these moves like knight bd7 in this position over here, in which we basically control all these dark squares. You can't push here because I'll just capture. You can't push here because I'll just capture as well. And so our opponent's kingside attack is going nowhere. And if they ever decide to capture here, we can capture back with e5, and all of a sudden we have complete control of all the dark squares. This pawn chain is not very good for our opponent. The bishop on g2 is garbage, and we have a very powerful knight on h4 and e5 as well. And so basically don't get scared whenever your opponent plays f4. It's not really a threat here, so don't you worry about this f4 move. And you can always move knight there, and just don't capture here whenever you don't need to. Because if you do capture in these positions, I made this mistake in the past. So let's say our opponent castles and you decide to capture at f4. Now this is when our opponent gets a pretty decent position because they get more center pawns, they have more space, and it's hard for you to get counterflight because you can't move your pieces out very easily over here. Like, where is your bishop going to go? Where is this bishop going to go? Where are the knights going to do other than just chill around over here? And so basically, as long as you know this knight f8 maneuver, you guys are basically fine in these positions. And if you don't, you might get into some trouble because this bishop on c8 will become a very big problem for the rest of the game. But once you stabilize, for example, you play knight f8, they play bishop e3, knight g6, queen d2. In this position, this is when you guys can go for the old but good variations in which you guys already know what to do. You just go for a pawn storm against your opponent. And if he messes up, you can already gain very large advantages against your opponent. Alright, so I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. This one was a rather short variation, but there's only one critical idea that you guys need to know. Basically play knight f8, also play pawn h6 whenever they play g4 so they can't play g5, but get the knight to g6. And this is a new idea in the Philidor that we haven't really talked about now. But the idea is quite simple. By putting the knight to this very nice g6 square, we can put it on h4 in the future where it's a very nice outpost, as well as it defends on g6 this e5 pawn from any f4 ideas in which they can capture and leave themselves with a weak e4 pawn. So hopefully this video was a little bit educational. Hopefully you guys understand the Philidor a little bit more. If you guys have any questions, make sure to ask me in the comment section below. I'll be sure to answer, and I hope you guys have a great day. See you guys in the next video.